Howdy ladies and gents, my name is Thom Gibson, and in today's video I'm going to show you how to get buttery smooth slow motion footage. So if you know beforehand that you're going to put a clip into slow motion, you can change your settings to make it optimal. If you go into your camera and then change the recording settings, you want to go for the highest frame rate possible. With my camera, it is 60 frames per second, even though it doesn't do 1920 by 1080p, it does 1280 by 720. It's a little bit of a smaller picture size, but it's a higher frame rate, so I'm going to go with that. There's usually a few different places on the camera that you can change the frame rate. Once you change the frame rate, you also want to change your shutter speed. It's this little number on the bottom here. The 60 actually means that the shutter is open for 1/60th of a second every time the picture is taken. You want to go double your frame rate. So if your frame rate is 60, which is what we changed earlier, then you want your shutter speed to be 120. 120 isn't an option on most cameras, so you go for what's closest. And in my case, it's 125. So a little bit about what 24 frames per second versus 60 frames per second actually means. 24 frames per second means the camera is taking 24 pictures every 1 second. 60 frames per second means it's 60 pictures. It's a lot more pictures in that 1 second. What ends up happening is if you pull a 60 frames per second clip into a 24 frame per second timeline, your video editor is going to drop a ton of those frames, so that way it only actually has 24 of those frames in the 1 second time span. But what we're going to do today is slow down the clip so that we don't lose any of the frames that we took. So if you look at this diagram, the yellow line on the 60 frames per second represents the 24th frame. Now, it didn't take a second to get to that 24th frame. It took less than half a second since it was shooting so many pictures. But if we slow it down so the 24th frame ends up playing at the 1 second mark, we get a lot more frames in that 1 second time span than if we shot it in 24 frames per second, which means it's going to be much smoother slow motion. So to actually do that, what I have here is a sequence. I've called it slow-mo sequence. It is 24 frames per second. It's going to say 23.976 because of some complicated stuff, but it's 24 frames per second. And I've got this clip right here. It's 60 frames per second. Again, you're going to see 59.94 instead of 60. If you're not sure how to create a sequence, you can go to File, New, Sequence, and then I just went to Digital SLR, 1080p and 24, because a lot of my other footage is 24 frames per second at 1080p. You can also right click on one of your other clips that is 24 frames per second, 1080p, and then just say new sequence from clip, and it'll make it that way. And I'm gonna pull this into my timeline. And it's gonna ask me, do you wanna change your settings so that it's 60 frames instead of 24 frames? No, I wanna keep it as 24 frames because I plan on making this in slow motion. With my camera, it did not create a full 1280 by 1080 resolution. And so you can right click on it if that's the case with you, and click on set to frame size. Not scale to frame size, but set. Then it makes it the size that you're working with on your timeline. And so let me zoom out a little bit. So if I wanna slow this clip down, I'm gonna right click on it and I'm gonna click on speed and duration. The magic percentage is 40% if you're going from 60 frames per second down to 24 frames per second. I click on OK. Now you'll notice it also slowed down my audio. If I don't want to slow down the audio and I just want to slow down the video, I can hold Option and then right click on the video clip. Then go to speed, go down to 40%, enter. So now it's 40% speed. Audio is still okay and clear, and you can see how much smoother it is when it is going that speed. I'm gonna mute this for now. Now, this clip I was panning and I kinda was shaking a little bit, and so I would wanna stabilize this clip. If I wanna do that, I can go up to Effects, and then over here under my favorites, I've got Warp Stabilizer. But if you try to do Warp Stabilizer on a clip that you have slowed down, it will say you cannot do that. But there is a workaround for this. I'm gonna cut this into a smaller piece, and I'm gonna pull my warp stabilizer. But before I do that, if I right click and I nest this, creates kind of like a sequence out of it. Now I can actually pull the warp stabilizer because I've kind of tricked it and said it's like, oh, this is just a sequence. It's not a slowed down clip. And so once it's finished, you've got this slowed down, warp stabilized, slow motion clip, and it looks really, really nice. And to compare without the warp stabilizer, it still looks good, but it's getting rid of a little bit of the up and down movement that's going on by stabilizing it. And that is how I shoot and edit to get the slow motion footage that I do. If you'd like to stay in the loop with any upcoming videos, I put a new video about every week with content ranging from mathematics and robotics education to filmmaking tips to vlogs every once in a while, and some creative projects thrown in the mix. So if any of that sounds of interest to you, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.